What happens when arrogance faces a judge who won't back down? The result is something you wouldn't believe. The courtroom buzzed with energy that Monday morning in Dallas, Texas. People settled into their seats, clutching their coffee cups, whispering about the trial that was about to unfold. It wasn't your typical day in court. Not by a long shot. The defendant, a man who called himself a sovereign citizen, had made it clear from the moment he entered the room that he would represent himself. His presence alone demanded attention, not because of his legal knowledge, but because of his raw, unfiltered arrogance. He swaggered to the defense table, his footsteps thundering with purpose, his stack of mismatched papers clumsily thumping onto the table. Every move seemed deliberate, a display of defiance. At the bench, Judge Amelia Gray sat, calm and composed, a seasoned professional in her late 50s. Her sharp mind and years of experience in tough courtrooms had earned her a reputation, fair but unyielding. She glanced at the man briefly before beginning. "Mr. Huntley," she began, her voice even but firm. "You've been accused of fraud and obstruction. Today, we will review the evidence and testimony before deciding on sentencing." But before she could even finish, Huntley let out a derisive scoff, leaning back in his chair, eyes narrowing as he interrupted. "Obstruction," he sneered, the words dripping with disdain. "The only obstruction here is this kangaroo court trying to silence the truth." A sharp gasp rippled through the room, but Judge Gray remained unmoved. Raising an eyebrow, she continued, "Mr. Huntley, I remind you to address the court with respect." He smirked, his eyes gleaming with defiance. "Respect? Respect is earned, Your Honor," he spat, the word honor sounding more like an insult. His voice oozed contempt, and the room fell into a tense silence, the air heavy with discomfort. The tension was so thick you could almost feel it buzzing, like the straining wires of an electrical fence. Most of the people in the room had come expecting legal drama, but this was something else entirely. Judge Gray's voice sliced through the unease. "You will get your chance to speak, Mr. Huntley, but let me remind you that decorum is not optional in this courtroom." Huntley didn't even seem to hear her. He folded his arms across his chest, muttering under his breath, loud enough for the front row to hear. One woman leaned toward her neighbor, her voice barely above a whisper. "He's going to push her too far." It wasn't long before he did. The judge, however, wasn't about to lose control, not yet. The air grew even heavier as Huntley leaned forward, his elbows planted firmly on the table, every inch of his posture radiating defiance. And then, he did the unthinkable. He interrupted the prosecutor's opening statement. Not once, but twice. Each time, he waved his hand dismissively, as if brushing away a fly. His voice roared over the proceedings, loud and unapologetic, silencing anyone who dared to speak. "Objection," he barked, even though no question had been asked. The prosecutor, a composed woman named Lauren Everett, paused, her lips tight, before glancing at Judge Gray. The judge gave her a quick nod, signaling her to proceed. But Huntley wasn't done. "This whole thing is a sham," he shouted, his voice echoing off the walls. "You don't even have jurisdiction over me." Judge Gray, calm and collected, folded her hands in front of her. Her gaze locked on Huntley, as steady as a mountain, waiting for the storm to pass. "Mr. Huntley, if you continue to disrupt these proceedings, I will hold you in contempt of court." But Huntley wasn't fazed. He shot up from his chair, the sound of it scraping across the floor making everyone wince. "Contempt? You can't hold me in contempt because I don't recognize this court." He turned toward the spectators, arms outstretched, as if addressing a cheering crowd. "You see this? This is the system trying to crush anyone who doesn't bow to it." The gallery erupted in murmurs. One man in the back muttered, "What's his deal?" Another whispered, "He's digging his own grave." Judge Gray tapped her gavel once, a sharp crack that silenced the room. "Mr. Huntley," she said, her voice cutting through the noise, "sit down, or I will have you removed." But Huntley wasn't about to comply. He jabbed a finger at her, his face twisted in fury. "You're nothing but a puppet, a figurehead for a corrupt system." And you think you can judge me? And then, he crossed the line. His voice boomed, filling the space with an arrogance that had no boundaries. Shut up! The room went dead silent. Even the stenographer froze, her fingers suspended above the keyboard. Huntley stood there, chest puffed out, daring the judge to respond. Every eye in the room turned to Judge Gray. She didn't flinch. Not an inch. Not a blink. She leaned forward slightly, her voice icy as it cut through the thick tension. Mr. Huntley, she began, her tone laced with calm authority, you've just crossed a line. Her words struck with the force of a whip, and the entire room held its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Judge Gray wasn't just about to hand down a verdict. She was about to deliver a lesson in humility that Huntley would never forget. She paused, letting the silence hang in the air like a storm cloud ready to burst. Then, she clasped her hands together and exhaled softly. The only sound in the room was the soft whoosh of her breath. Mr. Huntley, she said, locking eyes with him, her gaze unwavering, this courtroom is not a stage for your theatrics. It is a place of law and order. Your behavior is not only unacceptable, it is deeply offensive to the principles of justice that we uphold. Huntley smirked, arms crossed, as though he'd somehow won. But the look in Judge Gray's eyes told a different story. Without missing a beat, she turned to the bailiff. Bring Mr. Huntley a chair. He will stand trial seated until I say otherwise. The spectators exchanged nervous glances, some stifling their laughter, others stunned into silence. Huntley, however, looked absolutely incredulous. You can't, he started, but she cut him off. I can, she said, her voice sharp. And I just did. The bailiff, a stocky man who radiated quiet authority, moved toward Huntley. Sit down, sir, he said, his voice firm. Huntley hesitated, glancing around the room as if expecting some kind of support, but it never came. Reluctantly, he dropped into the chair, his face flushed with anger as he shot a venomous glare at the judge, like a child forced into timeout. But Judge Gray wasn't done. She addressed the courtroom, her voice rising just enough to fill every corner of the room. This is not about Mr. Huntley's opinion of me or this court. This is about accountability. He believes he is above the law, but let me remind everyone here today, the law is blind to arrogance, ego, and entitlement. Her words hit with the weight of a sledgehammer. Even those who had been annoyed by Huntley's antics could feel the power of her statement. Huntley shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his bravado starting to crack. Mr. Huntley, Judge Gray continued, her attention now fully on him, you stand accused of defrauding hard-working families, robbing them of their life savings. Yet here you are, mocking the very system that was designed to protect those you've harmed. Do you understand the gravity of your actions? Huntley opened his mouth to respond, but she held up her hand. Do not speak, she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. Your actions today have shown me that you lack even a shred of remorse. And for that, your sentence will reflect not only your crimes but your contempt for this court. The room was still as death. Judge Gray picked up the sentencing papers from her desk, her eyes scanning them briefly before speaking again. Mr. Huntley, she began, her voice as cold and resolute as steel, I sentence you to the maximum term allowable for your crimes, 15 years in state prison. Additionally, you will pay restitution to every victim you defrauded, with interest. A low murmur rippled through the crowd, but she wasn't finished. And finally, she said, her voice growing sharper, you will spend 6 months in solitary confinement. Perhaps that will give you time to reflect on what respect truly means. Huntley's face turned beet red. He jumped to his feet, sputtering in outrage. You can't do this. This is unconstitutional. But Judge Gray remained unfazed. You've already demonstrated that your grasp of the Constitution is tenuous at best, Mr. Huntley, she said, her voice dripping with icy contempt. Your outburst only confirms it. The courtroom was filled with a tense silence, a silence so heavy that it seemed to hang in the air, thick and oppressive. The gavel struck, and the words echoed across the room, but it wasn't chaos that followed. Instead, it was a profound stillness. No one cheered, the spectators didn't need to. Their faces, solemn yet satisfied, spoke volumes. Judge Gray had done what so many had doubted she could. She had kept her composure, upheld justice, and, most strikingly, defied the arrogance that had long stood before her. As the sound of the gavel faded, time seemed to stretch. For a brief moment, no one moved. The weight of what had just unfolded hung in the air, as if the room itself was still processing the significance. Then, slowly, the reactions began to ripple through the gallery. At the front, an older man, his face marked by years of experience, nodded with quiet approval. His thin smile revealed a glimmer of something deep, respect, perhaps. He leaned over to the woman beside him, whispering words that were barely audible, but undeniably powerful. "That's the kind of justice we need more of." The woman's response was subtle, a small nod of agreement, but her gaze never left Huntley. The once arrogant man who had filled the courtroom with his defiance now sat in stunned silence, drained of his former bravado. Behind them, a young woman, one of Huntley's victims, wiped away a tear. This was her moment, her long-awaited taste of justice. She had spent months hoping for this, longing for closure. "I didn't think he'd ever get what he deserved," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. The stranger beside her placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. There was a fleeting sense of peace, but the weight of her pain was still palpable. Not everyone shared in the quiet satisfaction, however. Near the back, a man, impeccably dressed in a crisp suit, one of Huntley's associates, shook his head, muttering under his breath. He rose abruptly, his steps deliberate, echoing through the hushed room. The sound of his exit was sharp and unmistakable. His departure didn't go unnoticed by Judge Gray. She watched him leave with a steady, measured gaze, a silent acknowledgement of his discontent, before turning her focus back to the proceedings at hand. Meanwhile, Huntley remained seated, a shadow of his former self. His confident posture had crumbled, replaced by fidgeting, the nervous energy of a man whose reality had just shattered. He looked around the room, his eyes skimming the faces of those who had once feared him, some now filled with quiet satisfaction, others with a quiet sympathy for his victims. The harshness of his punishment was sinking in, but what he failed to see was the flurry of activity just beyond his reach. Reporters, pens moving furiously across notepads, were already piecing together the narrative of this moment. This wasn't just a legal case, it was a story that would go beyond these walls, one that would ignite debates on justice, privilege, and respect. The bailiff's approach broke the silence, and as he moved to escort Huntley from the room, a murmur rose among the crowd. As they passed, a woman in her 40s, dressed in simple yet professional attire, stood. She didn't hesitate. "Maybe this will teach you to stop destroying people's lives," she said, her voice firm, unwavering. The words hung in the air, potent and cutting, but Huntley did not react. His gaze remained fixed downward, avoiding contact, as the bailiff guided him out, shrinking under the weight of his own downfall. For the first time that day, he seemed inconsequential, a small figure lost against the grandiosity of the courtroom. Judge Gray, preparing to leave her bench, paused. Her eyes swept across the room, the weight of the moment pressing down on her every word. "Let today serve as a reminder," she said, her voice carrying the authority of the occasion. "The law is not a tool for manipulation or a platform for arrogance. It is a shield for the vulnerable and a sword against those who abuse power. Let us never forget that." The room fell silent once more, as if her words had carved through the very air. And then, slowly, the crowd began to disperse, each person carrying the weight of the moment with them. Outside, the fresh morning air felt different. The events of the day had already begun to stir discussions in small groups, voices hushed but filled with emotion. For some, this case was about justice served, a rare instance where arrogance had finally met its match. For others, it was a lesson on the consequences of unchecked ego, on how it can poison not just a courtroom, but the very fabric of society. One woman, holding a notebook filled with trial notes, spoke passionately to those around her. "It's not just about what Huntley did," she said, her voice steady, "it's about how he carried himself, like the rules didn't apply to him. That judge, she didn't just punish him for his crimes. She held up a mirror. Nearby, the young woman who had lost everything to Huntley's scheme shared her feelings with a reporter. "I don't feel happy about what happened in there," she said, her voice trembling with vulnerability. "But I do feel closure. Maybe now, he'll understand the damage he's caused. And maybe others like him will think twice." For some, it was Judge Gray's words that would linger long after the day was done. The man with the weathered face, standing just outside the courthouse, reflected on the events. As he lit a cigarette, he muttered, almost to himself, "Respect isn't about power. It's about knowing that some things, some people, deserve it. Whether you like it or not." That's what Huntley missed. And he paid for it. The case quickly became a topic of fiery debate, sparking heated discussions on social media and in newsrooms. Some commentators condemned the harshness of the judge's decision, while others celebrated it as a necessary stand against entitlement and arrogance. But through all the noise, one question echoed louder than the rest: what happens when respect is no longer optional, but demanded? The following day, a juror spoke on a podcast, reflecting on the proceedings. "What struck me most," she said, "was how Judge Gray handled herself. She could have lost her cool. She could have lashed out. But she didn't. She showed us all what real authority looks like: calm, measured, unwavering." For many who had followed the trial, the lesson was clear: respect isn't just earned. It's a baseline expectation. To undermine it is to invite chaos, to invite consequences. As the sun set over the courthouse, the building stood in quiet reflection. Inside, the chairs were empty, the echoes of the gavel long faded. But the story of what happened here, the story of a man who thought he was untouchable and a judge who proved him wrong, would live on, etched into the memories of those who had witnessed it. And the lessons? Those would ripple outward, shaping the way we treat one another, in courtrooms, workplaces, and homes. What truly mattered now was whether those lessons would stick. Would they change how we move through the world? The courtroom drama wasn't just about one man's downfall or one judge's poise. It was about something deeper: the need for mutual respect and accountability in a world too often steeped in entitlement and arrogance. Huntley's downfall wasn't just a consequence of his crimes, it was a result of his refusal to acknowledge the basic decency we owe one another. The lessons from this case? They're bigger than any one person, they belong to all of us.